The fog rolled in early that morning. Not the thin, restless kind that danced above the treetops, but a thick, static haze that sat heavy over the snow-crusted plains of Labrador. Even the wind didn't dare stir it. Rowan Beckett stood alone on the rusting deck of the outpost, mug in hand, eyes locked on the edge of nothing. From here, the world looked like a canvas left blank on purpose, too quiet, too clean, too still. Inside, the hum of the tram Keetung kept its usual rhythm. Dull fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across half-unpacked crates and forgotten tools. The machines were old but precise. She had kept them alive the way someone might keep old secrets reluctantly but faithfully. Rowan had lived alone out here for nearly 3 winters. It wasn't punishment. It was preservation. In a world drowning in noise, she'd chosen silence. The outpost was a dead zone for cellular signals and, more importantly, for people. That's why the signal shouldn't have been there. It started 2 nights ago. At first, just a tremble, a barely there disruption in the low atmospheric frequencies she monitored nightly. She'd brushed it off as atmospheric pressure, maybe solar interference. Labrador had its moods. But then it came again. And again. Always the same pattern. A series of pulses buried deep in the subharmonic range, like something breathing under the floorboards. Not natural, not accidental, and definitely not weather. Tonight it was stronger. Rowan adjusted the frequency isolation filter, hand steady breath, shallow. On the waveform display, the pulses etched themselves in precise succession, 1 long, 2 short, 1 long again. Then silence. Then repeat. Not static, not random, a message, but encoded in what and for whom. She leaned closer. Her fingers hovered above the old decoding pad, then pulled back. No, not yet. You don't crack open a whisper until you know who's listening. Her eyes flicked toward the frost-laced window. Outside, the fog hadn't moved, not an inch. Even the stars seemed smothered. Back when she worked encryption for the MOD, patterns like this weren't just monitored, they were hunted. Patterns meant intention, and intention meant someone had built it to be found. But here in the middle of nowhere, who would be broadcasting at this range? And why layer it so deep just to loop it endlessly? Unless it wasn't meant to be heard by many. Just one. A thin unease coiled around her ribs. She pulled her wool sweater tighter, sat down at the desk, and pressed record. Local log, 22:28 hours, December 11th. 3rd instance of low-frequency irregularity detected. Pattern consistent with previous nights. Duration 13 seconds. Signal origin undetermined. She paused, then added, beginning to suspect intelligent origin. We'll analyze deeper structure after sunrise. For now, logging for redundancy. The screen dimmed, silence again, but not the good kind. Somewhere behind the wall, the frequency recorder chirped twice. A new spike, not part of the pattern, not in the same channel. Rowan froze. Another burst. Shorter, no rhythm, but it was there. She dragged the audio to the waveform reader and hit play. What came through wasn't a pulse. It was a voice. Distorted, fragmented, but unmistakably human. She replayed it, slowed it, tried to filter it, but every layer she peeled back made it feel closer. Not clearer, closer. She didn't write it down, didn't log it. Something about it felt watched. Instead, she shut off the speaker, killed the screen, and walked to the far end of the station. There, behind an old tarp and 2 fuel canisters, was a battered radio unit she hadn't touched in months. She hesitated, then flipped the switch. Static. Then beneath the white noise, a faint echo of the voice again. Not from the speaker, from the air. Rowan stepped back. The fog outside pressed up against the windows now like it wanted in. She didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in encryption, in patterns, in people behind curtains pulling strings no one was meant to see. But tonight she didn't know what unnerved her more, that someone was speaking to her, or that she might be the only one left to hear it. The storm had passed by morning, but the air still carried that strange kind of quiet, too sharp, too hollow, like the forest was holding its breath. Rowan hadn't slept. She sat hunched over the receiver, half-drained thermos by her side, eyes burning from the screen's pale glow. The looped pattern had changed at 0317. A new distortion. Subtle, but there. She isolated the waveform, ran it through the old military decryption module she kept offline. Not because she thought she'd ever need it again, just habit. The result wasn't perfect, but it was unmistakable. A ghost frequency. One she hadn't seen in over a decade. She stared at the designation string at the bottom of the screen. QS16A7, Charrington Relay Uplink, MOD subnet echo. Rowan blinked. Once? Twice? No. That couldn't be right. That relay had been buried, decommissioned, gutted, classified out of existence. She'd watched it happen. Hell, she helped shut it down. She checked the signature again. Same call structure, same triple handshake protocol, even the scrambled checksum fit. But the part that stopped her wasn't the uplink. It was the routing node. Eden Beta. She exhaled sharply, fingers tightening on the edge of the desk. The name punched through the years like a sharp breath against glass. Eden. Her sister. Rowan leaned back, heart-knocking once then again. The cold in the room suddenly felt sharper, like it had teeth. For a moment, it felt like she'd stepped into someone else's memory. Eden Beckett. Systems architect. Former cybernetics specialist. She'd walked away from military AI development 6 years ago, publicly at least. Quietly, she'd taken a position at a research hub in northern Yorkshire, Charrington. They hadn't spoken since the tribunal. Since the silence that followed their last conversation, brittle as ice and twice as cruel. And now the signal, the one hiding in the fog, buried under forgotten frequencies, was bouncing off a relay no one was supposed to know still existed, routed through a code name only 2 people had ever used. Rowan swallowed hard. The tremble in her hands wasn't fear, it was recognition. She called up the encrypted logs Eden used to maintain when they worked together, back when they still believed they were building something that might protect people instead of watching them. One of the old keys still worked, sloppy, not like Eden, or maybe meant to work. Like a door left unlocked but barely cracked open. Inside the file, a string of test patterns blinked to life. Not military, not surveillance, something else. Compressed neural data structures. Rowan froze. She'd seen these before. Once. On a black site job that got scrubbed before it even reached Parliament. The project name had been Auralith. The concept, weaponized frequency cognition manipulating behavior through low-band AI pulses. That project was shut down. Discredited. Because she'd testified against it. And Eden, she never forgave her for that. The realization hit slowly like thawing ice under her skin. The signal wasn't a leak. It wasn't a rogue broadcast. It was a test. And Eden knew Rowan was the only one still listening on those old bands. So why send it here? Why now? Unless it wasn't meant for her. Unless Rowan had intercepted something she was never supposed to hear. The dread settled in her chest like a second heartbeat. She cross-checked the routing timestamps. The signal originated from Charrington Grid 6, which should have been a vacant logistics zone. Except 5 months ago, the government greenlit a new AI ethics lab on that exact plot. Public-facing friendly branding. Nothing flagged. But when Rowan scraped the domain logs beneath the clean government pages, she found server routes protected by Silvergate, a firewall only used on classified defense contracts. Someone was hiding something inside the lab Eden now called home. And someone was using a dead relay network to broadcast signals across the Arctic fringe. Why? She zoomed in on the last loop. There, underneath the audible distortion, was a data burst. Compressed too tightly for civilian gear to register. Rowan loaded it manually. As it unpacked, the screen filled with fragmented frames, moments frozen in grayscale static. Images of a room, white walls, no windows, figures seated motionless, monitors on their heads. One of them was shaking. Rowan's breath hitched. The compression degraded their features, but the silhouette of the woman in frame number 16 was all too familiar. The way she held her hands, the angle of her spine. It was Eden. But her eyes, they weren't looking at the camera. They were following something that wasn't in frame. Rowan sat back, breath shallow. This wasn't a test. This was a warning. Whether from Eden or about her, Rowan didn't know. But the signal had traveled too far, hidden too deep, and arrived too precisely to be coincidence. And somewhere between Labrador and Yorkshire, between buried guilt and weaponized silence, something had begun to stir. Something that wasn't meant to be found, and yet had called her name from across a frozen sky. The air in Heathrow was thick with static. Rowan could feel it in her molars, the dull, humming pressure that came from being back in a place she'd sworn off years ago. England hadn't changed much, but she had. Her passport was a lie. Her name, her history, the credentials on her badge, each detail meticulously forged, each movement rehearsed. Rowan Beckett no longer existed. Not here, not now. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, discreet, forgettable. She didn't glance at the surveillance domes or the quiet men with earpieces stationed near customs. She knew where not to look. By sundown, she was already outside Charrington. The facility was buried behind 3 layers of fences and polished stone walls dressed as a private behavioral neuroscience lab. Officially, it studied the effects of frequency therapy on anxiety disorders. Rowan knew better. She scouted the grounds from the tree line, cold wind biting her knuckles, breath shallow behind a filtered mask. There were no guard dogs, no armed patrols, just cameras, drones, and silence. The kind of silence only secrets know how to keep. She broke in just after 0300, not through the main gate, but a maintenance tunnel left off the grid. Every building had one weak vein. This one bled into the utility floor beneath the east wing. The corridors were white, clinical quiet. Too quiet. Rowan moved with the ease of someone who had done this before. Because she had. Countless times. But never with her sister on the other end of the map. She installed the first bug and event behind Lab C. The second went under the main boardroom table, right beneath a branded quote about harmonized human potential. The third and most dangerous she planted in the server bay. That's where the truth waited. She cracked the system through an old exploit buried in the subnet, something Eden must have overlooked or maybe left behind on purpose. Either way, Rowan slipped inside the architecture like a ghost in the wires. What she found made her blood turn to ice. The project wasn't called Echo Neural. That was the public-facing name. The real designation buried in the root logs was glass signal. Not just an algorithm, not just signal modulation. A full-spectrum neural calibration system, triggered via tailored audio frequencies. Adaptive, predictive, self-learning. She scrolled through the internal presentations. No names attached, just voiceovers warped and flattened. But the phrasing, the cadence, it was Eden. The human brain is not a fortress, it's glass. You don't break it, you tune it, until the reflection changes. Rowan sat still in the server bay, her pulse thudding in her ears. Glass signal wasn't theory, it was deployed. They were already testing it on public subjects. Transit hubs, hospitals, correctional facilities, all logged as low-risk pilot zones. She played back a surveillance clip attached to one of the trials. A train platform. The crowd was restless. A woman was shouting. Then the frequency was engaged. Within 8 seconds, the entire crowd went silent. Breathing slowed, movement subdued, smiles formed. All without a word. Rowan couldn't move. She dug deeper. Internal memos, update logs. Glass signal had a failsafe mode. Override. Used when subjects resisted. She watched a clip. A young man shaking, panicked, then going limp, eyes unfocused. Heart rate falling. And staying down. No one reacted. The staff simply logged it as a stability saturation incident. Rowan backed away from the terminal, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't therapy. This was control. Glass signal wasn't a project. It was a weapon. And Eden had built it. Or worse, was still refining it. Rowan left the server bay with her chest hollowed out and burning. The last bug went into Eden's private office. No name on the door. Just a fingerprint reader and a hidden camera overhead. She got in. Somehow. The fingerprint scanner had already been breached, overwritten with a secondary key. Someone else had been here recently, someone Eden trusted or feared. The room was cold, clean, no family photos, no personal artifacts, except on the desk, an old compass, brass, faint etching on the rim. Rowan turned it over in her palm. Her name was scratched on the back, RB, for the road back, E. A gift from before. Rowan swallowed the ache in her throat. She planted the bug under the desk and activated the mic. It crackled, then silence, then footsteps, not hers. She ducked behind the cabinet just as the door hissed open. A figure entered. White lab coat, black gloves, hair pinned. It was Eden. Rowan barely breathed. Eden sat at the desk, placed a tablet down, and spoke patch 4.7a complete. Testing confirmed. Deployment set for Sector 12 within 72 hours. Civil sync predicted at 93%. A voice responded from the tablet, distorted synthetic. Any signs of outside trace? Eden paused. One anomaly. Northern intercept on band 16, most likely static bounce. We're scrubbing it. Rowan's heart stuttered. They knew. They knew someone was listening. She crept out after Eden left. Silent. Shaken. The bugs were active. The data was transmitting. But the clock had started ticking. She didn't return to the safe house. She didn't sleep. She sat in the back of a rusted-out van outside Charrington and listened. Voices poured through, conversations, briefings, but one recording broke through everything else. Eden, alone? Her voice was low, controlled, but not cold. You always saw the wires, Rowan, but never the reason they held things together. You looked for danger in the code. I looked for order. A pause. Then you were supposed to walk away. Why are you listening again? Rowan stared at the recorder, hands shaking. She hadn't heard Eden say her name in years. And now, even without being in the room, Eden had spoken directly to her. As if she knew. As if she always knew. The signal hadn't just been a test, it had been a breadcrumb. Glass signal wasn't just an experiment, it was a threshold. One humanity wasn't meant to cross, and Eden was already on the other side. Rowan didn't sleep. Again. Sleep was a luxury for people who didn't know what she now carried. Data burned onto 3 cloned drives, one buried in an abandoned shed north of Leeds, one inside the dashboard of the stolen van, and the last locked in a Faraday pouch, strapped against her ribs. She moved like a ghost through the outskirts of Charrington's city lights, flickering behind a web of trees and sodium fog. Every step she took now had to serve 2 purposes: get the truth out and stay invisible doing it. She still remembered the last time she saw Michael Aroon before the scandal, before the blacklists. He'd been the kind of journalist who didn't just write headlines, he cracked the foundations they stood on. The ministry shut down his last piece before it even reached print, buried under a national harm injunction. But Rowan knew where to find him. A coded drop through a secure chat protocol they'd used years ago. She didn't sign it. Just 4 words, glass signal. It's real. And a drive. No names, no threats, no demands. Just the kind of poison truth a man like Aaron would know how to weaponize. She left the drive behind a rusted panel in the southbound tunnels of Paddington. An old Cold War radio code was scribbled on the envelope, for signal calibrate truth. She never waited for a reply. Instead, she went back to Charrington. One last thing needed doing. Rowan disguised herself as maintenance. Not the obvious type. She slipped in wearing the bland, unnoticeable shell of a vendor tech contractor badge, high-vis jacket clipboard. Her posture tired, mildly irritated, underpaid. Security barely looked at her. The internal meeting Eden had scheduled was flagged as closed strategic review. Conference room 4B, soundproofed, logged off network. Of course. But soundproof rooms could still echo if you knew where to plant the ears. Rowan slid a slimline mic into the vent slot behind the ceiling panel 2 hours before the meeting began. Wired to a low-frequency directional transmitter masked inside a cleaning drone. It fed straight into her receiver parked outside in a council bin 2 blocks away. By the time Eden and the others entered the room, Rowan was back in her van, headphones on, breath-steady fingers ready to hit record. The voices began. Eden first. Calm, clinical. The pilot results confirm our trajectory. Behavioral modulation consistent across all demographics tested, voluntary and otherwise. Someone else spoke older British accent tinged with corporate rot. And the descent zones, the outliers. Phase 3 will address them. Signal refinement is underway. We've integrated response adaptation. The system now learns from resistance. Rowan's jaw clenched. That word resistance, like defiance was a virus to be cured. A third voice cut in. Neutral, American. How long before we scale to urban broadcast? Eden answered. Not a pause, not a flicker of doubt. 17 days. We start with London, then Montreal, then Prague. By Q3, we've aligned hemispheric saturation. One emotional spectrum. Globally calibrated. A slow exhale. Laughter. And who will know? No one, Eden said. That's the beauty. They'll feel better, calmer, focused, and they'll think it was their idea. The recorder clicked. Rowan closed her eyes. There it was. The portrait. Eden, her sister, was no longer just the architect of a program. She was sculpting behavior itself. Emotions, reactions, entire populations tuned like violins in a machine's hand. But this time, Rowan wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to confront. She wasn't going to fall into the trap of trying to save Eden. She was going to expose her, publicly, surgically. By morning, Aaron had posted an encrypted link. No attribution, no signature, just a headline. The glass signal exists. Within hours, forums caught it. Then indie papers. Then international outlets. Then the ministry issued a denial, which only made it worse. The leak included everything: behavioral trial footage, audio from the meeting system architecture code, AI model logs, scrubbed of her fingerprints, buried under layers of dead-end IPs and mirror networks. Rowan watched it unfold from a worn motel outside Sheffield. The screen lit her face in flashes of headlines, disbelief, outrage. She felt nothing. No victory, no relief. Just a tightening in her chest, a silent wariness. Because Eden hadn't tried to run, hadn't gone underground, hadn't said a word. She was still at Charrington. Still working. Which meant either she was planning a countermove, or this had always been part of the design. Rowan clicked off the screen, checked the recording again, backed it up, twice. The only sound in the room was the hum of the radiator, and outside, somewhere past the fogged glass, the faint tremble of city sirens in the distance. She sat in silence, waiting for the next echo. The world didn't end when Glass Signal hit the news. It just changed its tone, like a piano detuned in the middle of a song. Something wasn't right anymore, and now everyone could feel it. News anchors whispered phrases like behavioral calibration and mass tuning initiatives. Officials stumbled through denials. A minister resigned. Another disappeared. But it was Eden the spotlight followed. 3 days after the leak, she was summoned before an ethics tribunal. Not a trial. Not yet. Just questions. Unrecorded. Quiet rooms with mirrored glass. No cameras. Rowan watched it from afar. Not the hearing those were sealed, but the fallout. The analysts fumbling for language. The panic in their eyes when they realized control had been wielded without their consent. But nothing hit harder than what came next. The fourth data node, Rowan had secured one she hadn't cracked before finally unlocked. The key wasn't technical. It was temporal, a time-triggered encryption. And the moment it opened, she understood why it had waited. Inside was a voice recording. Not an official memo, not a log, a personal one. It started mid-sentence like Eden hadn't meant to record it but had left the mic running. We never called it theft. Not then. We called it preservation. You don't let something that powerful vanish just because it costs someone everything. Silence. Then her voice again quieter. Rowan's data structures survived the breach. She never knew. The architecture was perfect. Raw, emotional, unpredictable. It became the baseline model for Signal Phase 1. I didn't have a choice. Rowan sat perfectly still. Her palms had gone cold. People think control comes from force. It doesn't. It comes from understanding someone so completely they don't even know when they're being rewritten. The clip ended. No signature, no timestamp, just silence. But that was enough. 10 years ago, there had been a breach and accident, the official line had said. A catastrophic system collapse during a test run at a ministry facility. Data gone, code fragments corrupted. Rowan had been the lead engineer. She'd taken the fall. Lost her clearance, her career, her voice in the room. Now she knew why. Eden hadn't just watched it happen. She had mined the wreckage. Glass Signal wasn't born from Eden's genius. It had been grown from Rowan's ruins. The betrayal wasn't just technical, it was intimate. A sister had used another as blueprint, as prototype. Rowan stepped away from the monitor, the file still open like a wound. The motel room around her blurred. Not from tears, those didn't come, not anymore. But from rage so sharp it made her see clearly. The pain wasn't just that Eden had lied, it was that she had believed at some point that it was worth it. That the world needed fixing and Rowan's voice had always been the wrong frequency. The tribunal wouldn't be enough. The public wouldn't understand the code behind the crime. But Rowan would. She knew how systems broke. She knew where the real pressure points lived. Not in the hardware, in the story. So she began crafting one. Not a confession, not a retaliation. A reconstruction. One that would thread the truth together from every signal Eden had sent. One that would remind the world and herself that data could be rewritten. But memory, that stayed fractured, and now Rowan would make sure everyone saw the cracks. The shutdown came like a whisper. No sirens, no headlines screaming in red. Just a quiet press release, 4 paragraphs buried mid-scroll, announcing a temporary halt to all cognitive modulation trials, pending an internal ethics review. Glass Signal was dead, or at least shelved. Eden didn't disappear. They didn't let her. She was placed on protective investigative hold. A phrase that meant she couldn't leave, couldn't speak, and couldn't stop what was coming next. The tribunal expanded, private hearings became public, auditors poured into Charrington, data centers were locked, key personnel vanished behind the word cooperation. Still no one spoke Rowan's name. There were theories. Whispers about a whistleblower from inside the early architecture team. Old colleagues speculated, officials denied. But there was no trace, no leak trail, no fingerprint. She'd made sure of that. By the time the public started asking who, not just what, Rowan was already gone. She boarded no flight, used no passport. She crossed back into fog the same way she'd first left it without permission. It took her 11 days to return to Labrador. The station was exactly as she left it. Cold, quiet, undisturbed. The fog, as always, greeted her first. She stepped into the outpost with no ceremony. Boots-soaked coat heavy with rain. She hung it without thinking. Her fingers remembered the habit. She didn't turn on the receiver, didn't check for signal. The air no longer carried whispers. The sky was just sky again. She sat by the window that night wrapped in silence. The outside world raged on parliament hearings, civil protests, journalists still peeling back layers of the glass signal project. Debates flared about privacy control ethics agency, but none of it reached here. The snow began falling sometime after midnight, fine silver dust catching on the ledge, softening everything it touched. Rowan sipped cold tea, eyes unfocused, not tired, just emptied. There was no sense of victory, not really. Justice had been served, maybe, but in pieces, and at the cost of something permanent. She'd cut her name out of every system, erased herself from the archives of her own story. And Eden, whatever came next for her, it would never undo what had already been done. Because some betrayals don't unburn. They leave behind rooms you never return to. She thought of the compass still sitting in her coat pocket. She hadn't looked at it since Charrington. She held it now, let it rest in her palm. The lid clicked open with a soft breath. The needle spun, then stilled. Due north, back here. Rowan didn't cry, didn't speak. She simply sat. No signal, no war, no more lies. Only the slow, steady hum of silence and the sound of snow beginning to bury the past. The notebook was older than it looked. Its spine-cracked margins filled with code scribbles, half-legible thoughts, pieces of equations never quite solved. Rowan flipped to a blank page near the back. The pen in his hand felt heavier than it should have. He didn't write for anyone but himself now. No directives, no audience, just ink and what remained of memory. Glass signal terminated. Primary architecture confirmed compromised. Behavioral sync models traced. Root exploit repurposed neural scaffolds legacy extraction layer. A pause. He stared out the frost-lined window. Fog again clinging to the earth like breath that refused to leave. Origin confirmed Eden beta. Core deviation emotional calculus. Intent layered behind calibration. He tapped the pen once against the page, let the silence settle. Then wrote, secondary pulse detected, unrelated to original relay, new signature unknown source. Because it had returned. At 2:11 a.m., the receiver had come to life. Just once. A brief tremor across the low bands, barely audible, barely there. Not Eden's pattern, not the same modulation, but familiar. He'd isolated it, played it back. It was a single tone, clean, unbroken. And it ended with a brief deliberate pause. Not noise, not weather, not an echo. A message. He didn't try to decrypt it, not yet. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, let the wind push against the station's walls like a question too large to answer. Someone else was listening, or maybe reaching. He closed the notebook, slid it back into the drawer beside the old compass. The same one that had brought him home and now sat motionless, its needle still even as the world turned. Outside, the fog thickened. And Rowan whispered not to the room, not to himself, but to the silence beyond the glass. Someone else is listening. He didn't smile, didn't fear it. He just waited. Because the fight to hold on to truth rarely ends in noise. It ends in stillness, in someone staying behind when everyone else moves on. To hear the signal no one else can. What do you think about the above stories? If you were me, what would you do? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.